Welcome back to Childhood Interrupted. Today we have Kevin Scott, who has a not unfortunately unique story of being an adult who discovered he was alienated from his father a lot later in his life. So, Kevin, I'm just going to let you kind of take it and start off where you feel comfortable with.
Sure.
Just one question. How long were you alienated from your father before you realized it?
Yeah, so on and off, I was alienated from my dad for 37 years. And there were, as we get into the story, there were degrees of severity of that alienation, ranging from no contact whatsoever to attempted contact to some contact to visitations, things like that. And once I get into the story, that's going to make a lot more sense. But it was 37 years, 7 months ago, to the point where I actually discovered and figured out what had gone on, and that was a really unique experience in and of itself. So we'll get into that in a little bit, I think.
Okay. So let's just basically start. You were how old when your parents separated?
Yeah, so I think a little bit of background here is helpful. So I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and my earliest memories from childhood involve my dad, and we were very, very, very close. We had a very, very, very close bond. We had a very normal relationship in a lot of ways. My dad had a blue bike that he would put me on where he would bike me around Kansas City. He would take me to the park. He would take me to the Lakeside Nature Center, which is a nature center where they have animals and snakes and things like that. And he would show those to me. He would take me to the Kansas City Museum. They have taxidermy, things like that. The train station was a favorite place of ours. He would take me there. For the most part, we had a very, very, very normal and very loving relationship. And for the first 3 years of my life, he really was kind of my primary caretaker because he was a sort of a house flipper entrepreneur type. So his schedule was a lot more open. And my mother worked in healthcare. So she would work during the day, and my dad would be home with me during that time. And so all of those kind of main early childhood landmarks, learning how to walk, learning how to talk, learning how to do those things, he was the one that taught me those things. So we had a very, very, very close bond. And then at some point between the age of 3 and 4, I woke up one day and my dad wasn't there. And that was how it started. Now, what you also have to understand, though, is my mom and dad went through lots of periods where, they would get into an argument and my mom would take me and would run. And where she would go would be Columbia, Missouri, which is about 2 hours away. That's where her folks lived. And so there were also these periods of separation where she would take me, she would run. My dad would track her down, would go find her, would ask her to come home. And then eventually she would move back in. There would be this reunion, things would be fine. And then there would be another separation. And so that went on for a long time. And then finally the divorce happened when I was between the ages of 3 and 4.
So prior to the actual divorce, you were already put on a roller coaster of up and down
Correct.
contact and everything.
Correct. Yeah, I was. And what's funny about it is I don't remember a great deal of that part of it. I do remember after the divorce. I remember that. And there was, again, the early memories there in Kansas City are all good. They're all good memories. My dad and I had a very normal, very loving, very warm relationship. And then one day I woke up and he wasn't there. Um, and that was really when the alienation started. Now, what I'm going to ask you guys all to do here is I want you to put yourself in the position of a child, because sometimes what we do is we look at these kinds of stories and we ask ourselves, and a lot of parents that are being alienated from their kids ask these kinds of questions. Why doesn't the kid just realize what's going on? Like, don't they know that I love them? And I want you to understand how malleable kids really are. it's not actually that hard to brainwash a kid. It's actually quite easy to do. If you want proof of that, just look at how easy it is to get a kid to believe in Santa Claus, or something like that. It's not that hard to mess with a kid's memory. And that's what began to happen with me. So my relationship with my dad was a very warm and loving one for the first 3 years. My mother was a very, very, very complicated woman. And one of my big rules when I tell this story is there are no heroes and there are no villains. There are just people who do things. Okay. An alienator is a person with a mental illness, full stop. And that was my mother through and through. My mother suffered from what I now know to be Munchausen's by proxy, if you've ever heard of that. It's a mental illness in which the individual believes that people around them are sick and they must be the caretaker. They have to medicate. And my mother worked in healthcare. And so that was actually the reason why my parents split up. My mother began to medicate me very heavily for illnesses that I did not have. My father realized this and attempted to get her help, and she responded by leaving him and accusing him of child abuse because he would not medicate me in the way that she thought was proper. So that was how all this began. That was actually how the child abuse label first began to be applied to my dad. It was not in the guise of, your father is beat me, or your father's sexually abusive, or any of those things. Those allegations would come later, believe me. But in the beginning, it was he's abusive because he's not medicating you. Now, my first recollection, and actually what's weird about this is actually the earliest memory that I have of my mother. This is the earliest memory that I have of her. My like I said, I woke up one day and my dad simply wasn't there. And all of a sudden I was in offices and I was with social workers, and they were asking me, did I want to see my dad and these kinds of things. And so at one point I remember going to a social worker and saying, I'd like to have more time with my dad. I said, I'd like to have longer visits with my dad, because at that point, his visits were restricted to like an hour in a room with a social worker. And I'm going, no, I want to go to the zoo. I want to go back to Kansas City. I want to ride around on the bike. That's what I want to do. And so I said to this social worker, I'd like to have longer visits. And at a certain point, there was a conversation with my mother in which she found this out, that I had said this. And she responded by absolutely just screaming at me. And I was like 4 years old. And she said, don't you realize that if you have longer visits with your father, he's going to kidnap you? He's going to kidnap you. That's what he's going to do. He's going to take you away. He's going to come in the night and he's going to take you. And you'll never see me again. You'll never see your grandparents again. You'll never see your little brother again. You'll never see anybody again. Now, is that what you want? And I just broke down crying. I broke down, no, mommy, I don't want that. I'm 4 years old at this point. No, mommy, I don't want that. I don't want that at all. And once she was convinced that I was crying hard enough, she called the social worker and said, well, mommy will sort this out. She calls the social worker and says, this boy seems afraid of his father. I think his father may have done something to him. And that was really where the really serious allegations started. Now, through all of this, my dad, he put up a fight. I mean, I'll say that much. And sometimes I have to say that when you're being accused of the kinds of things that my dad was being accused of, and I remember pretty shortly after that, after the initial he's going to kidnap you thing, the stories got wilder and wilder. My mom would tell me that my dad had one of her favorite stories to tell is, the night I left your father, he had always been abusive, but he went too far. We had a fire in the fireplace, and he pulled a flaming log out of the fireplace and he hit me in the head with it. And he came after you with it. And I picked you up and I raced you down the street. And then I vowed I would never let you see him again. She would tell me things like that. She would tell me that he had threatened her at gunpoint, things like that. And eventually she told me that he had molested me. That he had molested my little brother. And what you have to understand is that when you're a kid hearing these things, your brain is not developed to the point where you can examine them critically. You don't have those critical thinking skills. All you know is that you love your mom and you love your dad, and you have one kind of relationship with your dad, but your mother is telling you things that are very, very, very different, and you trust her too. So, what do you do with that? And I think looking back on it, what it did was it put an idea in my head that would later prove to be very, very, very dangerous. And that idea was that somehow my father was dangerous. Somehow my father was malicious. Somehow there was something sinister or shadowy about my father. And I developed a kind of phobia almost that, well, one day, like, this is going to come out. Now, through all of this, my dad never stopped fighting to get me back. And eventually, even though there were a lot of really ridiculous allegations being thrown at him, he did eventually get his visitation rights, and I was able to see him on the weekends. And at this point, I was about 6 years old. That was when that happened. And my dad purchased a plot of land outside of Columbia, Missouri, because he wanted to be closer to me and my little brother. He wanted to live closer to us. And he started building a house out there. And it started out actually as a cabin. And that's where our visitations would happen at. He would take us out there. We would stay in the cabin. And I have some beautiful memories of that place. He was a really good storyteller. He would, take us to movies. He's a very, very smart man, naturalist, those kinds of things. He would take us around in the woods and show us the different bugs and lizards and birds and things and tell us what they were. And throughout all of this, there was never even a hint of abuse. There was none of that. But what would happen is that sometimes, actually, every time I had a visit, my dad liked to buy me things, little presents and little trinkets and things like that to remember him by. And when I would go home, my mother would take those things away from me. She would say, "No, no, 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 you can't have those." And eventually, she remarried my stepfather, who's a very, very, very religious guy. And eventually, that took on like a religious bend. Like, my dad would buy me a Ninja Turtle. You can't have that because it's ungodly, and we're going to take it away. And there was almost kind of like this purging thing that started to happen. I would come home, and if I even brought up the fact that I had had fun on this visit, my mom would get very, very angry. She would punish me for those kinds of things. Eventually, that got transferred over to my stepdad. So if I saw a movie with my dad that my stepfather didn't think was appropriate, I would get punished for that. My little brother and I both would. We would get punished for that, yelled at. Sometimes we would even get like spanked for that. Those kinds of things. And again, enter into the mind of a child. You don't understand that this is wildly inappropriate. You just understand that you're supposed to trust your mom, you're supposed to trust your dad, but something in this whole arrangement feels really, 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 really wrong. Okay. I'm going to fast forward to when I was about 12, because that was really when things hit the fan. So I had continued to have these visitations with my dad, and they were very normal. They were very, very good, very just normal father-son loving stuff. When I was about 12 years old, my brother began to have an unhealthy obsession with fire, and he would burn things. He would light things on fire. And one day we were out on visitation with my dad, out on the land, out at the cabin, and my little brother got a hold of a book of matches and a candle, and he lit the cabin, the house that my dad was working on fire. And it was a small fire, but it was still a fire. And in that moment, I saw my dad do something that I had never seen him do before. He grabbed my little brother, and with an open hand on the back, he hit him. And what made that so jarring for me, though, was part of what made that so jarring looking back on it was that I had never seen my dad do that. And there was fire. It was an emotional reaction that he had. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I don't think you should hit a kid at all. My dad wasn't perfect, but in the entirety of the time that I knew him, that was the only time I ever saw him lift a hand against anybody. But in that moment, when I saw that, what you have to understand is that my mom had already loaded the cannon with all these ideas about my dad, that he was abusive, that he was violent, that he was a drunk, that he was all these things. So what did I do with that? Well, I sat on it, and when I went home, I said to my mom, Kelly, that's my little brother, Dad hit him this week. And my mom said, "What do you mean he hit him?" And I described the situation to my mom, and my mom said, "I don't think you're telling me the truth. You say he used an open hand. He used a fist, didn't he?" And I said, "No, no, no. You tell me the story again. He used a fist, didn't he? Tell me the truth, Kevin." And eventually, I said, "Yeah, Mom, he used a fist." And this isn't the first time this has happened either. This has happened before. Was your dad drinking when this happened? No, he wasn't drinking. Yeah, he was. Tell me how he was drinking. And I remember her going over this story with me for weeks, where like we would go over it for an hour and then, okay, go play. And then she'd pull me back, tell me again. And then eventually the story turned into he's this violent, abusive, horrible person who beats kids and does all these things and threw me downstairs and 100 other things. And then when the story was exactly where she wanted it, she put me in front of a judge in the form of a guardian ad litem, and I accused my father of child abuse, which he was not guilty of. And that broke me. Now, what you have to understand is going through all that, what I now understand is that by the time I was 12, I had full blown PTSD from all of this. I didn't know it at the time, but it's become very, very apparent now that that's what's going on, that's what was going on at the time. And when you take all of that and you have all of these really, really beautiful memories of your dad, but then you're accusing him of something that deep, deep, deep down inside, he's not actually guilty of, but your mom has told you all these things and you saw something that was pretty jarring and all this stuff is going on, it confuses you. You're a very confused, very divided, very fragmented kid. And from that, I developed full-blown PTSD. Now, once my mom got the story where she wanted it, she pulled out a restraining order against my dad. And again, I was between 12 and 13, somewhere in there. And I didn't see him for about 3 years. And during that time, my mother continued to pour the ideas into my head. And again, the stories got wilder and wilder and wilder and wilder. And when you're that age, you don't understand what crazy looks like. You just understand that you're supposed to trust your parent. And finally, when I was 16, my dad, the court intervened, and we had court-appointed visitations with a psychologist. That psychologist, I think he's retired, but he's in Kansas City. His name is Dr. Gregory Sisk. You can look him up if you want to. But that was the court-appointed psychologist. And within a month of seeing us with our dad, he went before the court and he said, "These kids have been alienated from their dad. Their dad is not abusive. I've seen no evidence of that." The problem is that my dad was not made of money, and my mom had a lot of money, and she had the resources to hire lawyers, and he didn't. And so what ended up happening was that my mom hired 2 different guardian ad litems who spent about 5 minutes with me and took my mom's word on everything. And in court, they made my father out to be this really malicious, terrible, horrible person. Meanwhile, in these court-appointed sessions, by this point, when you have an alienation, it's almost like the alienating parent is working the kid like a puppet. So I remember being in these sessions and saying all these horrible things about my dad. "I hate you. I never want to see you again," all this other stuff. And then I would just go home and hole myself up into a shell. I would cry. It was a really, really, really difficult time. And it was around that time that I began to self-harm. I still have scars from that, from my high school years. I would self-harm. The amount of guilt that a kid carries around because of that experience, you can't even describe it in words. You can't. I lost a bunch of weight because I had trouble eating. I would throw up, insomnia. I mean, you name it, just all the kind of your classic PTSD symptoms, migraines, all this other stuff. And the problem is that, every once in a while, my mom would say, well, we need to get Kevin help. So she'd hire a counselor. But the problem is that before the counseling even began, the counselor would be under this idea that the reason I was experiencing all this was because I had a father who had beaten the hell out of me. And so already before the sessions even began, they had adopted that narrative as like, this is what we need to help Kevin process. And I would just repeat back what I had been brainwashed into believing. Yep, that's what happened. Yep, we're talking about it. Yep, now I feel better, and now I can go on and be strong and wonderful in the world. And all of the symptoms remained. Now, in spite of all of this, I grew up and I learned how to function. And at a certain point, I became a reasonably successful parent. I've been married for 10 years. I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary. I have three beautiful children, ages 7, 4, and 2. I became a pastor because I wanted to help people. I pastor a church with a good-sized school in Maryland, near Baltimore. And in spite of all of the challenges that I had endured, I grew up and I became reasonably successful. Now, at a certain point, in spite of all of this, I grew up and I became reasonably successful. But at a certain point, even before I discovered really like the truth, I began to question a lot of what my mom was telling me, because I started to pick up on the fact that there were inconsistencies and a lot of things that she would tell me about her health, about her personal history, about a lot of other things. And when this really came out was when I started having kids, because then my mom really started to try to influence the way I was parenting them. We had a falling out, and she died actually when my second child was born, that same year. So about 4 years ago, my mom died. And there were some very, very weird things surrounding the way that my mom died that I'm not going to get into exactly, but it looks like her death was a result of her own kind of over medicating herself, is really what it's looking like happened there. But in spite of all of the challenges, I grew up and I became a reasonably successful person. But what I could never really get away with was this sense of loss. I was haunted by this deep sense of sadness, anxiety, problems with memory, ADHD type symptoms, those kinds of things. And actually, at one point, I even was diagnosed as ADHD, and the symptoms were all correct. The problem is that we didn't talk about the past at all, because it was almost like a lot of this stuff, it was locked away in a box. In PTSD, there's a phenomenon that's called dissociative amnesia. And I want you to remember that, because I think a lot of kids that are alienated from their parents are dealing with this. And the reality is that if the strain of something like this becomes too much, or if it becomes too much for a child's brain to process, they just lock it away. Now, those memories don't go anywhere. They go deep, deep, deep into the subconscious, where we don't have access to them. So how did I gain access to those memories? That's what I'm going to talk about now. My journey of reunion with my dad and healing really began 7 months ago. And I had been getting into a really bad routine where I was working very, very, very hard at my job. But when I had a day off or when I was by myself, these feelings of anxiety, loss, sadness, frustration would just come back. And I had no idea where they were coming from. And finally, one day after a particularly bad weekend, I looked over at my wife and I said, honey, I can't do this anymore. I think that the stress of ministry is just getting to me. I've spent too much time in hospitals. There's just too much stress. I think I need to see somebody. And so she said, okay, I'll find you somebody. And after a couple hours online, she said, how do you feel about seeing a Jewish rabbi? And I said, I'd be okay with that. She said, okay, I'll sign you up. So that was when I met the man who really kind of changed my life. He saved my life. He's a rabbi. He's a counselor. His name is Yisrael Roll, and he has a practice in Baltimore. And I remember the first time that I sat down with him, it was 7 months ago. He looked at me and he said, okay, Kevin, so why are you here? And I began to talk about, just the feelings that I'd been experiencing. And I said, maybe it's workplace stress, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. I didn't mention one thing about my childhood. And still to this day, I have no idea how this man knew this, but somehow he was able to look inside of me and he was able to diagnose the issue. After listening to me for about 30 to 45 minutes, he put up his hand and he said, Kevin, stop. I know what's wrong with you. And I'm thinking, okay, that's definitive. What you just met me. What do you mean you know what's wrong with me? And he said, Kevin, Here's what you need to understand. You and I share a common faith because we both accept the existence of God and the soul. And you have a soul, and that soul was given to you by God. It's eternal. But what you have to understand is that residing in that soul is every single person that you have ever been or ever will be. And at some point in your life, there was a child, and that child felt stuck and isolated and out of control and scared and hurt and sad and alone. And you need to go find that child and you need to let him speak because he was never allowed to speak. And you need to listen to him because when that happened, when that loss happened, that tore a hole in your soul. And right now you're bleeding. That's what's happening. We need to go find that kid and we need to allow him to speak. And I'm listening to this and I'm going, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That was my initial reaction. I'm serious. I'm like, this is dumb. And I wanted to walk right out of there. But he said, no. I want you to try this. He said, what's a feeling that you're struggling with? And I said, well, I feel loss. And he said, okay, pick a memory. What's the first time you began to experience that? So I picked a real specific one from when I was around 12. And he said, okay, I want you to breathe. And he had me do some breathing exercises. And he said, okay, now I want you to visualize this kid. And I began to feel something when we began to do this. There was a feeling that I started to feel on the inside and I couldn't really describe it. And that was when I said, okay, I think there's something to this, Rabbi. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm feeling kind of different. I don't know if I like this or not. And he said, okay, Kevin, we're going to stop here. And he said, what I want you to do is I want you to wait 3 or 4 days. And then I want you to go home and I want you to repeat this exercise, but I want you to make sure that you're in a safe place when you do this. Because sometimes we have things locked away in the unconscious. And when those things come out, it can be kind of scary. It can be kind of messy sometimes. And I want you to make sure that you've got people around you that love you and care about you. And so I'm hearing this and I'm going, yeah, like how bad could this be? Like really, like how bad could this really be? And so I did exactly what he said. I waited, 3 or 4 days and I went back and I repeated it. And this time I was alone. I was in my bedroom and I remember it. It was visualization. I pictured myself as a 12-year-old kid, hearing all the, feeling all these things. And I visualized myself as a 41-year-old adult, going to that kid and saying, I'm here for you and I'm going to keep you safe. Whatever it is that you have to say, you say it to me. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to hurt you. Whatever it is that you have to say, you say it to me and I will listen to you and I'll keep you safe. And I swear this is true. In my mind, as this is going on, that little kid, that 12-year-old, reached up and took my head and bent it down. And he whispered into my ear, I miss my dad. And when that happened, the floodgates opened. And it was like getting almost 30 years worth of trauma downloaded into your brain all at once. And suddenly you see everything clearly. And I cried out. I mean, it was like a wounded animal coming out of me. I didn't recognize the sounds that were coming out of me. I was howling. I was sobbing. I was crying more intensely than I ever have. It was like just this floodgate coming out of me. And I cried out for my wife and I said, honey, like, I need you. And she comes running in there and she grabbed me because I was in the fetal position on the bed, just sobbing. And I couldn't talk for probably a solid 45 minutes. I was crying that hard. And finally, after getting to a point where I could, I looked up at her and I said, honey, I have something to tell you that I've never told anybody in my life. And I told her exactly what I just told all of you. And she was very, very, very supportive. And the next few days were rough. There was a lot of crying. There was a lot of really specific, there were a lot of really specific memories that started to kind of flood back. But I began to notice pretty quickly that I was feeling very, very, very different. All of a sudden, it was like I wasn't feeling as anxious anymore. And all of a sudden, it was like, I could think more clearly. All of a sudden, it was like when I would do a task, rather than it being all over the place, it was like it was a straight line. And I began to really like how I was feeling. It was a totally new experience for me. And it was funny because this was after one session with my counselor. So I went in for session number two. This was like, 3 weeks later after all this. And as I'm going in there, I'm going, okay, if that much happened after session one, I don't know what to expect here. Like if God pops out of the wall and says, "Hi, you found me," it's not going to. So I walk in there and, I said to the rabbi, I said, I'm going to ask you a really weird question, and I need you to be truthful with me. How did you know what you knew? And he smiled at me and he said, "Why do you need to know that?" And I said, "Well, because I care about the truth." And he said, "So the truth is important in your story." And I said, "Of course it is." And he said, "Okay, let's talk about that." And I began to describe, I told him exactly what I just told all of you. This is my story. And as I began to describe this, his face like went pale. And he came over to me and he put his hand on me and he said, "Kevin, what you experienced was something I'm very familiar with because I've been a witness in 3 different court cases like the one you just described. That's parental alienation, and that is child abuse. And parents lose custody of their children for doing that." And he said, "Kevin, we've got a lot of work to do here." Now, over the course of 7 months, though, after all of that came out, I reunited with my dad. I called him up. We hadn't spoken in 12 years. And I just cried. And I said, "Dad, I didn't know. And now I do." And he sobbed and he said, "Kevin, you've never been far from me. I've always loved you. And I knew that someday you'd figure it out. And I've been praying for that day. And I'm so glad that you have." And we just cried, and it was so, so, so emotional. And like 3 weeks later, I jumped on a plane in the middle of a blizzard. And I was like, nothing is keeping me away from my dad. I want to embrace him. I want to kiss him. And I flew to Kansas City from Baltimore in the middle of a blizzard. And I said, nothing is keeping me from my dad. And we spent 3 days together. I drove down to the land where the cabin still resides. My dad still owns the place. And I drove down there again. There was 10 inches of snow on the ground. And I borrowed a truck from a cousin and made it in there. Climbed into the cabin. There were pictures all over the wall of me when I was a kid. More memories came back. It was just this overwhelming kind of flood of emotion. And, I'm still in therapy, but I will say that before going to therapy, I was on medication for ADHD. I was on medication for low testosterone, for hormonal imbalances. I was on medication for migraines. I was on medication for insomnia. I'm off of all of that. Okay. And I am having none of those things anymore. And I would say those real nasty, kind of PTSD symptoms that people have, those are down 85%. It's not perfect yet. I still go to therapy and I'm still working on, some of the kind of core issues that are still there. But the path to healing is actually, it's difficult, but it's simple at the same time. Learn the truth and reunite with the alienated parent if you can. So that's my story. I moved kind of fast through some of the parts. So if there's anything that you want more details on, or if there's anything that I can help clarify, I'm happy to do that. I'll also say that my little brother experienced an alienation. He's 2 years younger than me. He experienced the same kind of alienation, but it was also different in certain ways. And he hadn't spoken to my dad in 20 years. And yesterday, he reunited with him. I was able to facilitate that. And how that came about was as I began to kind of discover these things. My brother and I have always been close. He said, "Kevin, I've heard things that are very, very different than what you're telling me, but I know that you're my big brother. I know you'd never lie to me, especially not about something like this. So I'm going to trust you because something about this feels right." And he said, "I want to do this in my own way, in my own time." But he reunited with dad yesterday. It was absolutely gorgeous. And he's on his path to healing too now as a result of that. And I'm really grateful for that too. So,
Well, Kevin, it's listening to your story as a journalist, I'm kind of flabbergasted because a lot of what you describe is what's described in domestic violence cases with the reprogramming, the storytelling, the alternative events that actually took
yep.
place. You basically went into what we all know as a survival mode when you were a child.
Correct.
Uh, your case is one of the more horrific ones I've had the displeasure, and don't take this personally, of hearing.
Yeah.
Uh, but one of the things that I wanted to ask about was when all this started and you were going to the counseling and everything. Did none of these individuals that did none of them ever question
No.
these
So
events?
this is no. So this is what you have to understand. So what I found out that some of this when I began to kind of discover the layers and the truth of all this, it was like going down the rabbit hole. I'm not even kidding. It was like playing detective in the worst mystery of all time that you don't really want the answer to, but you can't really stop. And so my mother was adopted. And at a certain point in her life, when she found that out, that was a deeply traumatic experience for her, and she never recovered from that. And so, what I actually learned in kind of piecing this together, I had to go back through and I had to learn who my mom really was. What I found out is that she'd actually been in a mental institution in 1978. I never knew that. She had been committed for delusions. For She had a psychotic breakdown, and when she was released back into the care of my grandfather, who was a wonderful man, by the way, her adoptive parents were not abusive in any way. But when she was released back into the care of my grandfather, she responded by committing grand theft auto and racing down to Florida with a guy that she met in that mental institution and marrying him. And my grandfather put out had to press charges just to find out where she was. She was arrested in Florida. My granddad went down and got her, helped her get the marriage annulled, and then she met my dad 2 years later and told him none of this. So, I mean, but the other thing about her that you have to understand is this is going to be really weird to hear, but my mother in certain ways could also be a very beautiful person. I do have good memories of my mom. And in forgiving her, what I've come to accept is that she was not an evil person. She was mentally ill and she needed help very badly, and she never got it. My mother was very charismatic. She could make you believe anything. When she was in her heyday, she was gorgeous. I mean, she was blonde hair, blue eyes, 90 pounds. She was a dancer. She was absolutely stunning. And she was very charismatic. I mean, she was very, very, very convincing. She was a very good liar. And she played the battered woman role to a T. She was really good at it. And I think that in working with these counselors, um, she was really convincing for one thing, and for another thing, I was sort of validating everything that she was saying, and so nobody really ever thought to say,
I'll tell you that Santa Claus thing.
Yeah,
Wow. Wow. What a great analogy
that
to
was a
bring
good
up.
point that he brought up because we do tell our kids,
Yeah.
here he is.
And it's not malicious, but it is brainwashing. And so, you got
Yeah,
to ask yourself, what age was I when I started not believing that?
yeah. So Kevin, go ahead and unmute yourself again.
okay, there we go. Okay, there we
Okay,
go.
there we go.
Yeah,
Yeah, so none of these professionals ever caught on to the falsehoods of what was going on, or that was a
no,
parental alienation. And so
no.
it was just kind of allowed to happen.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what would happen is that
So,
in each of these cases, the therapists would meet with my mom first, and also my stepdad, and they would kind of validate everything that, or they would receive this narrative first, and then I would validate all of it, and then they were working with under that, and then it kind of became this. I don't know. I don't know how to put it. It was almost like um, I took on the role of the abused child. That's the best. It was a role I was playing, if that makes sense. And I actually
yeah.
was being abused, so the symptoms were quite correct. Like I looked like an abused kid. I was clearly traumatized, and I was giving this detailed account of this father who was so malicious and abusive and sexually abusive and all this other stuff. And so the counselor, yeah, that tracks, like he looks like a trout. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And what none of them really, what I now understand after, studying this myself, and I've listened to a lot of lectures on things like the attachment system and what normal child behaviors are, I now understand that it's very unnatural and almost unheard of for a kid to actually want to cut their parent out of their life. Kids don't do that. That's a very unnatural behavior, even in cases where kids actually are being abused really badly. It's deeply wired in our DNA and our biology to attach to the parent. So for a kid just to say, I don't want anything to do with you, now that should really be a red flag to any therapist dealing with this. If you see that, there's something going on. That's a really unnatural behavior for a kid to do. But again, back then, I just think that a lot of these counselors were not equipped to look for that kind of subtlety. They just kind of accepted what I was saying and what my mother was saying as the gospel truth, and then that was what they were working with. So it became sort of this almost like self-fulfilling diagnosis, if you want to call it that, right? It's like, now we've diagnosed it, now he's working through it, now he's overcome it, now he's well, so.
So let me ask you this, and I believe I asked the same sort of question to Dana Laquadera when we interviewed her on her experiences as an alienated child.
Yep.
Did you ever confront your mom on all this?
No. So my mother died about 4 years ago. And in saying this, and it was really interesting because my brother this week actually said something very, very, very similar, but I would not have been able to probably deal with this to the extent that I have with her still living. My mother was a master manipulator. She was a pathological liar, and not only about things involving my dad. She told me a lot of really nutty stories about a lot of things, but you have to put yourself again in the position of a kid. Kids don't know that this is crazy. Kids don't know that when their mom is saying that she can talk to angels, or that God's told her she's never going to die and she's going to get beamed up to heaven and all this other stuff, that she's got powers to heal people. And these are all things my mother told me, when I was, 11, 12 years old, things like that. As a kid, you don't understand that that's crazy. You don't get that. You just understand that, okay, this is my parent telling me this. I'm supposed to trust her, so I should just believe her. It's not that hard to brainwash a kid, unfortunately.
Let me ask you this. How do you feel about your mom now? I mean,
yeah,
that's a question we ask across the board is,
yep,
knowing
yep.
what you know now.
So one of the things that makes overcoming this so traumatic is that you have to, overcoming alienation is almost as traumatic as the experience of being alienated, because you have to grieve the loss of two parents. You're grieving the loss of the parent that you've been alienated against, even if they're still living, because you're grieving things like, my God, my dad should have been at my wedding. My dad should have been at my graduation from college, high school, grad school. He wasn't at any of that. I should have had Christmases with my dad. I didn't have that. He should have met his grandkids before now. So you have to grieve all that. But then you're also grieving the loss of the parent that alienated you, because at least in the case of my mother, she had built up this image of herself that she was the perfect parent, the perfect mother, all this other stuff. And my healing really involved tearing that down to discover who she really was. But I'll say that in doing that, that's what enabled me to forgive her. I love my mother dearly. I do. I don't hate her. There was definitely a period in this processing where I had to confront some very deep feelings of anger towards her. Sometimes I would just go out in my car and I would just yell at everything that I wanted to say to her, but never got the chance to, and I would just be screaming. But eventually I got past that. And the more that I learned about alienation and the more that I learned about her as a person, I realized that she lived a really sad life. And she was a very sad person, and she died alone. When my mom died, I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. I had actually cut her out of my life because of the way that she was starting to act towards my kids. And I began to pick up on some of the dishonesty and some of the manipulation, even though I didn't know the full extent of it at that point. And so when she died, the alienation almost had kind of backfired on her, even though I didn't know the full extent of everything that I now know. I love her. I have good memories of her. She was not all bad. And what I really wish is I wish that she had gotten the help that she needed. She was mentally ill, plain and simple. My counselor said something my rabbi said something really interesting to me one time. He said, Kevin, what you experienced is you were raised in a household where every single person was telling you the earth is flat. And deep down inside, you knew that the earth was round. And that's a good way to look at it. My mom lived in a world where the earth was flat. She didn't live in reality. She was psychotic. Now we hear the word psychotic and we think that means scary or Hannibal Lecter or whatever. And psychotic just means they don't live in reality. That's what psychosis is. You don't live in reality. My mother didn't live in reality, and so for that reason, I pity her. I love her. I hate what she did, but I can separate the behavior from the person. I can do that. My mother was a deeply traumatized little girl who never got the help that she needed. And in that way, she wasn't all that dissimilar from me because for a long time, I had trauma too that I didn't know about. And I probably did some things not out of malicious intent, but because I didn't know any better. My son didn't meet his grandfather for 7 years. So in that sense, I was alienating him from my dad because I believed things about him that weren't true. That's what my mom was doing, I think that's a good way to look at it. And I think that eventually, as hard as it is, if you're an adult survivor of this kind of thing, you can't hang on to the hate forever. You can't do it. You got to find a way to forgive. Alienators have mental illness and they need help. It's that simple.
So let me ask you this: when you were
Yeah.
alienated from your dad,
Yep.
did your mom still allow you to have access to grandparents on that side, cousins,
No.
so forth?
No. So eventually that alienation turned into everything that she was saying about my dad. She would start to apply to the rest of the Scots, right? Well, no, they're all like that. His brother is also, he's a child molester and they're all drunks and you're just better off without him. That was kind of the guise of that. And so the really beautiful thing about the reunification is that not only did I get my dad back, but I got a whole bunch of family back who are absolutely thrilled that I have figured this out. And one of them in particular was really helpful for me. He's my cousin. His name is Ron, but he's actually more like an older brother to me. He was about 12 years older. And he actually lived in the house for a while that I was born into. His mom was going through kind of a rocky split with his dad. And so my dad actually took him and his sister in, and they lived with us for a while. So he was there as he was 12, 13, 14 years old. He was there when all this stuff was going on and he was seeing it happen. So he was actually able to validate a lot of the things that I was kind of remembering. And he's like, oh yeah, like this is what happened. There was no abuse whatsoever. Yeah, your father's a flawed human being, but he's not like this. This is what happened, and that was really helpful for me to hear. There was a lot of validating too. I mean, I even went back to my mom's adopted family. I've got 2 uncles and 2 aunts on that side that I love dearly. And they had kind of shielded me from a lot of this information about my mom because I think they just felt bad for me. And once I kind of discovered all this, I went to all of them and said, this is going to be hard to hear, but this is what I've kind of figured out. And kind of slowly, one by one, they all said, yeah, your mom had a lot of problems. here's some information that we can share with you, now about this. That's how I found out about the, being institutionalized and her path of dishonesty that went back a long way. It really started actually with her finding out that she was adopted. That was when the lies really started. So
let me ask you this: on her side of the family, did any of them ever say, "Hey, she needs to stop. This isn't good for you," or anything like that, or did they just kind of not get involved?
So the thing about it is that they, I think that, like I said, my dad wasn't perfect, and a lot of times what would happen is that when he was getting these really kind of outlandish accusations thrown at him, like you're a child molester, or you're abusive, or you're this, or you're that, rather than stay calm and cool and collected about it, he would get on the phone and he would yell at my grandfather, for example. I know one time he said, well, if you think I'm a child molester, I'm gonna go to court and I'm gonna tell them that you're a child molester. My dad did that. Now that wasn't right for him to do, but when it seems like you're living in the twilight zone and everybody around you is kind of losing their mind, so I think that's kind of what happened. It was like when he would do that, they would go, okay, so maybe some of this is believable. And then because it's a family dynamic, they're taking my mom's side in this. And so there was a little bit of that went on, but also at the same time, they're all really, really, really good people. And when I kind of went back after this and started to come clean about a lot of this, they all said, yeah, we knew that your dad had a temper, but the idea that he would ever hurt you, we never really saw any evidence of that. So we really didn't think much of it until you started to say that was happening. And so we were like, okay, I mean, if Kevin's saying this, then clearly there must be something to it. And they were just as in the dark as anybody else about what parental alienation is, how it happens. It's a very, very, very complex dynamic. It can be very subtle. There's a lot to it. And so I think that, I don't hold anything against any of them. I love all of them dearly. They've been real supportive of the reunification and all of those things, and happy for me. And I think they've really seen the evidence is in the healing. If you see somebody who prior to all of this had, PTSD pretty bad, and now is feeling for the most part, pretty good, I think there's a lot of, the evidence really is there. So they're just happy for me. And, I've got a really big family. That's how I look at it. Does that make sense?
Joni, you had a question.
Yes. So, question and observation. It seems like the trigger for your mom was this finding out that her whole life had been a lie, basically, yep, and that she was adopted. And yep, okay, yeah, that's really hard for people of a mental health issue because they've already felt uncomfortable, like they didn't fit to begin with and they never could understand it. And now, oh, trigger. We always know there's a trigger when it comes to parental alienation.
Yep.
So this is kind of an interesting revelation. Now, not all alienators have this depth of mental dysfunction.
Yep.
The pattern is there, but your mother's went that step deeper, and that it's clearly quantified as that. But I'm going to tell you, it may also be a genetic predisposition. Because remember, being adopted, she might not know her own parents' medical history. So one of the things I want to commend you on is your compassion and empathy for her.
Yep.
This is one of the hardest things for us to be able to teach to our children and when they find out that they were alienated and that this parent did this horrible thing to them, they will automatically cut the other parent off. I get it. They need to heal. That's fine. But at some point, when they finally have that compassion and empathy to just let it go and say they were, as you were saying, you feel sorry for her. She never got the proper mental health care that she needed.
Correct. Yeah, that's
That's
right. I mean,
that's a huge realization, and I think you'll probably agree that at that point, when you could let go of all that and say that, your world just exploded into a more
yeah, well, what happens is that, you are both your parents. You are your mom and you are your dad, and you can't separate yourself from either one of those. Otherwise, you're denying a part of yourself and you're going to end up in exactly the same position that you were in before. So for me, I mean, I remember I did so much journaling after this. I mean, I was filling notebooks with stuff. And at one point I remember I did like a column thing. It was like mom, dad, good, bad. What was good about your mom? What was bad about your mom? What was good about your dad? What was bad about your dad? What did you get from both of them? Who are you? You know? And that was really healthy for me because rather than going, black and white thinking is not good. That's a sign of trauma. Black and white thinking is a problem. And once I was able to move to a point where I was able to view my mom really kind of without judgment. It was more, it's like I said at the beginning of this, in the narratives of our lives, there are no heroes and there are no villains. There are just people who do things. And people do things for various reasons. And the truth in my story is that many people did many things for various reasons. And the result is that there was a little boy who got hurt very, very badly. And that was me. And so looking back on that, sometimes my mom had good motivations. I mean, she actually believed that my dad was the devil incarnate. She believed that. She was wrong. She was living in a delusion, but in her mind, it was, no, I'm protecting my son. That's what I'm doing. So her motivations were good. She wanted to protect me. The problem is that she was delusional. She was mentally ill. That was the problem. Every once in a while, the feelings of anger come back. But when that happens, I try to remember the moments when my mother was actually genuine, when I actually saw who she was. And there were times that I would see that. She was a very, very gifted musician. She could play the piano. She could sing very, very well. And when it came to music, she and I could connect. And I got that from her. I play guitar. I love music. And that was something I got from her. My dad is not musical in the least. And so when it came to that, and having those kinds of memories, that was her showing me the deeper part, the true part, without all the lies, without all this crap, the actual true part of her. And I can love that person. That's who I love that's my mom, So, after all this, I went to her grave. I didn't go to her funeral, but I went to her grave. I paid my respects there. I actually put a cross on the ground that she gave me a long time ago, and it just says grace on it. I've got a picture of that. And that was kind of my way of honoring her and honoring the true person who she really is, So I could even say I miss her,
So, Kevin, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
If you had the ability to sit right in front of the 12-year-old you, what would you tell that 12-year-old you pertaining to all of this?
This is not your fault. This is not your fault. And what's happening to you is wrong. You are not wrong. What's happening to you is wrong. Because I think that when I look back on that, the emotion that I carried inside of me for so long that I didn't even know was really there was shame, embarrassment, guilt. Okay. I had a hard time making eye contact with people. I had a hard time connecting with people, and I didn't even know it. And after all this kind of came out, I realized very quickly, hey, wait a second. I can look people in the eye. How about that? Hey, if somebody's kind of trying to push me around, I can actually set a boundary and I don't feel so defensive about that. I can just do that. How about that? That's cool. So a lot of those kinds of things started to come out, and I realized, a lot of these behaviors that I had that I didn't really like and I knew they weren't so good, that was a kid. There was a child inside that was carrying all this stuff, and now that kid has had a chance to speak, cry, yell, and now is in the process of healing. So that's where all of this is coming from. So, and I've actually said that to that kid a lot. I've gone back in and talked to 12-year-old Kevin and 5-year-old Kevin and 20-year-old Kevin, and I've said that this is not your fault in the least. And that's very healing. That's a part of the therapy that we actually do a lot as we go back and we do that inner child stuff. And I think for anybody who's gone through this, that's That's what you have to do. You have to engage with that inner child, the unconscious, those kinds of things. So
See, that's one of the reasons why I asked that question was I think a lot of people forget that the child or the alienated child has all this that they have to deal with. Some of them, most of them, from what I've think, they blame themselves for something they took part in that wasn't their choice, wasn't their
correct.
forte.
But I think the other part of this too that made it, I'm not going to say easier for me, but my dad, I saw God through the actions of my dad, because in all of this, he never once took the anger out on me, not once. He never yelled at me. He never blamed me. Uh, he never laid a guilt trip on me. He never did any of that. As a matter of fact, when I reconnected with him, I was crying on the phone. I was sobbing, and I was just saying, Dad, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And he said, Kevin, you've never been far from me. You let that go, and it was just the most healing thing he could have said to me. You've never been far from me, and he's old now, he's 81. He's not going to be around forever. And I know that when he passes, that's going to be really, really hard for me. But knowing that I'm sorry, I'm going to get choked up over this now. But knowing that you've never been far from me. I can go talk to my dad anytime I want. He's here. He's in those memories, and I lost those for a while, but I got them back. And now they're not going anywhere. Those are really precious to me. I can have conversations with my dad. I can,
That's one thing I think that's important for a lot of alienated parents to understand is those memories we have with our kids are there. They're not going anywhere. They may be buried, but they're still there.
Yep. And I'll say this too. So when I started to put the story out on, Facebook and things like that, I had a lot of parents reach out to me, and they were asking me, what do I do? I haven't seen my kid in 20 years. I've been alienated. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And I'm not an expert. I just know from my own experience kind of what worked. And I will say that there was one thing that my dad did, and my dad is a very smart man. And one thing that he did, and I don't really know how to describe this other than to say it was like my dad left clues for me. He was very subtle about it, but it was like he left clues for me, knowing that one day I was going to find those, pictures, letters. He would do these things to kind of jog my memory almost, without being really overbearing about it. As a matter of fact, I remember, after the court appointed visitations that I was talking about, after all that, I was a mess. And, I was 19 years old. I was starting my first semester at MU, and he called me up completely out of the blue one day. And he said, hey, do you want to come have breakfast with me? And there was this spot that whenever we would have a visitation, we would always meet at this really specific spot to eat breakfast, and he took me there, and we just sat and we ate breakfast. And there was no great breakthrough there, but there were 100 little moments just like that one. And that was what he did very, very, very right. But that was what he did very, very, very wisely. He left these little subtle clues for me to figure out, and he found ways to jog my memory without being really over the top or like overbearing about it. And in the meantime, he established a really good support system for himself that I'm really glad that he had. So
let me ask you to describe the moment you and your dad reunited.
Like in person or like over the phone?
Yeah.
In person,
in person.
I saw him and I said, hey, Pops. And he said, Kevin, just like that. He was in a wheelchair, and I threw my arms around him, and it was like I couldn't stop kissing him. It was like I'm just kissing the top of his head, and I couldn't talk. I was so overcome and he couldn't talk either. We were crying. We were, and laughing too, like at the same time. And then finally, I look at him and he looks at me, and I kind of held his head like this, and I said, Dad, we're good. We're really, really, really good. And he looked right back at me and he said, Kevin, I never had any doubt that we were. And just, I mean, it's overwhelming just to think about. It was incredible. You know, I only got to stay a couple days with him, but I spent every minute with him that I could. You know, he's old, so he needed, nap time and things like that. And I was able to kind of help him get into bed. And, he would kind of say, "Hey, do you remember when we used to do this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I remember that." And do you remember when we used to do this? And it was a lot of just trading back and forth. And then eventually it came to the point of, "How's your little brother doing? Have Kelly give me a call, And that was when okay, so the healing's contagious, right? And so then that was when my little brother's story really kind of began. And so it was just, amazing, overwhelming. And then after that first reunion, then he met his grandson for the first time. I made a second trip just with my son, and they met, and that was just incredible. And then this week he met, my wife, his other two grandkids. My brother came with me this time, and it was just like, he used the word overwhelming to describe it. He said, Kevin, this is too much, but in a really good way. It's just, it's been really, really, really incredible. I almost don't have words for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, all the pieces are coming back together that had been broken, and now it's all coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Joni, you had something?
Yeah, you've said some wonderful stuff here, Kevin. So I wanted to tell you that journaling stuff you're doing, that's excellent. You can actually take it and throw it into AI and it'll write a book for you if you wanted out of it.
It's actually, I'm doing a podcast. So that's how I think I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna try to launch it later in the summer, but the running title that I'm working with right now is "The Lie, the Truth, and the Space in Between." And so I'm going to try to tell the story in an honest way. But in order to get to that place, I'll tell that story broadly eventually, but I have to find the right way to do it. And there's still some healing that needs to happen. I'm kind of doing this slowly. Tonight, this is a big step for me. So,
yeah, well, you know how to use AI and take your journal piece. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing is, did your mother ever find out about her biological parents?
Yep. So
was she abused by her biological parents?
No. So this is what. So her story is really interesting because she was adopted as a baby. She was adopted as an infant, and the lies. I found this out later on, but her pattern of lying started with she would tell her siblings these really wild stories about who her parents were, like definitively. Like, my dad is a secret agent, and someday he's going to come back and get me. Those kinds of things. Well, what she actually found out is that she was the product of an affair between a 15-year-old girl and a married man who had illegitimate children all over the place. And so, and that happened again. The timing of this kind of works out. That happened when I was about 12, and I actually brought that up in therapy. And my therapist said, maybe after having all these delusions of grandeur about who her father was, finding out that he actually was kind of a scumbag, it seems like, she projected that on you. And that was traumatic for her to find out. So now she's basically reliving that trauma through you and projecting that trauma into you. Is that a possibility? And I said, yeah, I think so. I mean, she clearly had a fear, a repulsion of men in general, but especially of my dad. So that doesn't surprise me at all. That makes all the sense in the world.
I actually tell my clients that the alienator is usually trying to save little them. And so they project their story through the children onto you in a way to save little them, because nobody ever saved them. The storytelling is very significant in that she felt like she was a nobody. So
Yep.
she had to have a story to be a somebody because she didn't have a history, if you will.
Yep.
So that's and I'm not going to tell you this is probably unique to your case, but I think that in some dimensions, this happens with a lot of alienators. They had dysfunctional family life or a realization during that time, like finding out that she was adopted.
Yep.
That's the trigger. There's always a trigger. And that when we know what the trigger is, it's easier for us and for our children to now understand and have compassion and empathy.
Yep.
And I think that's such a significant point that you've
Yep.
made. I also
Okay.
love the thing about the eye contact, the positives that she, you recognize in her.
Yep.
Something I always tell parents, you got to point out the positives in the other parent. And I loved your clue
Now,
thing that he left clues. If you could
yep.
give some examples of some of the
Yep.
clues
Yep.
maybe that
So,
he left,
yep.
that would be,
So,
I would love that.
Well, a really big one was like when I went out onto the land, and went back into the cabin, and it was like falling apart. Like after things really went south when I was 12, he kind of abandoned the land. I mean, it stayed in his name, but he never really went back there very much. So the cabin was like falling apart. I had to climb the wall to get back into it. But when I got back in there, there were just photos all over the wall of me when I was a kid, and they'd been there 30 years and they had never gone anywhere. And as I was looking at them, I'm like, I had this overwhelming sense of, Dad, you knew that I was going to do this someday. You knew that I was going to see that. That's the only reason why you would have picked these photos. That's the only reason you would have done that. There were pictures of like the Kansas City Zoo, which was a favorite place where he would take me to as a kid, photos from around Kansas City, those kinds of things. So, I would love to stay on, but I have to go rescue my wife from our children. So, is there any way, like, can I leave an email address? And if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me.
Yeah, what we'll do, Kevin, is when I get done editing all this, is if you want, I can add that email address
Yep,
onto the post, so anybody who
yep,
wants to contact you can reach out that way.
yep.
Listen, it was a great honor for us to be able to hear your story and everything, and
Nope, the honor's all
I'm
mine.
glad it works out for you. Let me just ask you a question in closing. Do
Sure.
you feel that what happened to you should be, how do I put this? Not criminalized, but
Yes,
punishing
yes,
somehow.
it should be. I think that in cases like this, if there isn't some kind of intervention, the child is going to suffer greatly. And what I actually realized is that I'm actually one of the lucky ones, because I had good memories from early on with my dad that predated the lying, that never really went anywhere. For a lot of these kids that go through this, paranoid schizophrenia, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, things a lot worse than PTSD. And so I think that, for the well-being of the child, there has to be intervention of some kind. Now, I hesitate to use the word punish, because you're not going to fix anything by punishing somebody with mental illness. There needs to be an intervention in which the child is taken into the custody of the parent from which they're being alienated against. And then there's some kind of reunification with the alienating parent so that things can be straightened away. That makes sense. There's a really good presentation on YouTube that you can watch. Dr. Childress, I think is his name, has some really good stuff on this. But that's how I view it. It's a mental health issue, and that's what needs to be dealt with. So,
Okay. Well, I appreciate you being on. And what we're going to do is, I know you're going to go rescue your wife. We're going to stay on. And folks, if you guys have any questions afterwards, just send them to us and everything. And we'll sit here and talk a little bit about what you just gave us and everything. Kevin, good luck. Keep us updated on what's going on.
thank
Maybe
you.
we'll have you back on at some point to
That'd be
kind of
great. Yeah, maybe.
brainstorm.
I mean, if I can get the rabbi back on, he's got an interesting perspective on this too. So maybe we'll try to see if we can break him away from his work for a minite.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Kevin.
and maybe next time you visit your dad, we can get your dad on.
There you go. All right. Thanks, guys. God bless you all.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
Amazing story.
Yeah.
I'm kind of flabbergasted, Joni. I really don't know. I mean,
He
his
said,
case was really intense, and he's been able to overcome it.
yep, he said so many important things, I think, for parents, both from the perspective of the child and from his father's perspective. And Doug Higby, I know, just put something in the chat. He can't wait to be able to say the words, "It's okay. We're okay. You've never been far from me." I think being able to let the child know that they don't need to have guilt, because I think that is the biggest issue for many of these kids. The guilt, the dichotomy, the splitting, they they are torn. And
I mean, we say it over
Kevin
and
was
over that
amazing.
these
It's
kids go
amazing that
into
he
a
survived it.
survival mode, but we don't. Yeah, yeah,
Survival mode,
and but we don't
self-protection mode.
really,
And
when we say they go into survival mode, we don't get into what they're emotionally feeling, what they're mentally thinking, and he did. He actually stated it. This is what these kids go through.